Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Welcome to the European Parliament for this very important conference on the elimination of violence against women in conflict zones. Something which I think all of us are very passionate about, all very concerned about, and I think that it's great that we've actually managed to get such a diverse group of people here today to discuss the issue. I'll just very quickly introduce myself. My name's Gary Cartwright. I work for the European Parliament. And I work in the office of Nikki Sinclaire. Nikki is an MEP, an English MEP, who does a lot of work on human rights. She's a member of the Subcommittee for Human Rights, and also on the Women's Rights Committee. And human rights issues very much dominated her first term in office. She was elected in 2009. Nikki is hosting the event, but unfortunately, I'm afraid she has to send her apologies because she's stuck in traffic. Now, any of you who know English motorways, and particularly the M25, all know the problem. It's not an easy journey to do by car, but she's bringing staff here for some press issues, so unfortunately that's the situation she's in. She's asked me if I can, first of all, to welcome you, but also to read some words that she prepared, a little bit of a statement on why she thinks this is such an important issue and on what are the most important factors. So with your permission, I'd like to read Nikki's speech on her behalf. One of the less palatable truths about the modern age is the industrialisation of warfare. Of course, the Holocaust is for many of us the ultimate testimony of man's inhumanity and blind indifference towards his fellow man. The Second World War also saw civilians being targeted deliberately. No longer seen as collateral damage, they became targets in their own right. The London Blitz, the bombing of Dresden, the rape and slaughter of civilians by the Red Army in Germany, these horrific episodes in our history should not only serve as lessons to us, but also as challenges. But the story does not end there. In fact, it gets worse. It's been claimed in some academic quarters that in just one decade, from the 1980s to the 1990s, the percentage of civilian victims of war has jumped from 74% to 90%. It is, of course, hard to discriminate on the basis of statistics between those who died violently and those who perished as a result of war-related phenomena such as famine and disease. But maybe we should actually include the latter in the equation, because violence is violence. Possibly the most comprehensive examination of civilian war deaths throughout history is by the esteemed historian and social scientist William Eckhart, who stated, on the average, half of the deaths caused by war happened to civilians. Only some of whom were killed by famine associated with war. The civilian percentage of war-related deaths remained at about 50% from century to century. Well, the United Nations now estimates that there's been an average 3-to-1 ratio of civilian to combatant deaths in conflicts worldwide. 3 civilians die for every combatant killed. In fact, that's also the estimated ratio in Afghanistan, 3-to-1. In Iraq and in Kosovo, it's actually been worse. The ratio is believed to be as high as 4-to-1. Disturbing anecdotal evidence suggests that the ratios were very much higher in Chechnya and prior to that in Serbia, where ethnic cleansing led to the deliberate targeting of the civilian population. To put all this into perspective, to talk about actual numbers, let's consider 5.8 million civilians were killed in the First World War. This, we were told, was the war to end all wars, the Great War. However, just a few decades later, during the Second World War, the estimates of civilian deaths are as high as 55 million. Nobody really knows what the true figure is, and that's very tragic in itself, I think. But whichever statistic we use as a reference, the fact is that more and more civilians are being targeted, and more civilians are dying in conflict zones. When we talk about civilians, we're of course talking about the most vulnerable members of our society, predominantly women and children. A feature of ancient warfare was the use of rape as a weapon of war. Sadly, we as a civilization seem to be regressing. The age of chivalry is over. Rape as a weapon of war is clearly back on the agenda. In 2008, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 1820, which noted that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or a constitutive act with respect to genocide. War rape has a severe impact on its victims. It may be systematic in nature or an isolated act of sexual violence. A recent UN study lists the effects on the victims of war rape as traumatic injuries, sexually transmitted disease, and pregnancy. Because war rapes take place in zones of conflict, access to emergency contraception, antibiotics, abortion are extremely limited. The short-time psychological injuries to the victims include feelings of fear, helplessness, and desperation. Long-term psychological injuries may include depression, anxiety, flashbacks, and difficulty in re-establishing purpose, shame, and persistent fear. Post-traumatic stress disorder, as we would call it in the armed forces. The UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon recommended to the UN Security Council in September of this year that girls and women raped in war should have the right to access to services for safe termination of pregnancies resulting from rape without discrimination and in accordance with international human rights and humanitarian law. Warring groups use rape as a weapon because it totally destroys communities, according to the Dutch soldier Major General Patrick Kamer, former commander of the UN peacekeeping forces in the Eastern Congo, and a man who's internationally renowned for his experience and his commitment in the area of peacekeeping. You destroy communities, he said. You punish the men and you punish the women. You punish the women by doing it in front of the men. It's probably become more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier in an armed conflict. And please, ladies and gentlemen, please think about that statement made by an experienced combat veteran. It has probably become more dangerous to be a woman than a soldier in an armed conflict. During Mozambique's conflict, young boys themselves have been traumatised by violence, who were reported to threaten or kill or starve girls if they resisted their sexual advances. Sexual assault presents a major problem in camps for refugees and the displaced, something which we're seeing more and more of at this particular time. The incidence of rape was reported to be alarmingly high at camps for Somali refugees in Kenya in 1993. The camps being located in isolated areas where women could be attacked at night or while looking for food or for firewood. The Nuremberg trials, which we refer to so often after the Second World War, condemned rape as a crime against humanity. Governments must be willing and able to enforce international law and codes of conduct. If we're to fight against human rights abuses, then as uncomfortable as the subject may be, we must shine a light on the issue and on the perpetrators. And that's what we're here to do today. Ms. Sinclaire also asked me to express her wishes that this not be just a place where you listen to speakers, but that this is actually a debate which must involve everybody. So please, she asks, if you have questions or if you have something that you would like to say, and we know that everybody here feels very passionate about this subject, please don't be shy, because actually this is as much your debate as it is anybody else's. And thank you very much. I'd like to introduce actually the gentleman to my right, Ala Abudaka, Program Manager for the GNRD, the Global Network for Rights and Development, an NGO, a human rights NGO established in June 2008 with the aim of enhancing and supporting human rights and development by adopting new strategies and policies for real change. Ala's job involves designing, planning and implementing advocacy strategy and campaigns for the organisation, lobbying here in the institutions and in the member states, and with various stakeholders to promote the interests of his organisation. Prior to that, Ala worked for the ICHR, the International Council for Human Rights, which is actually how I know Ala, because this is not the first time that Ala and I have worked together, not the first time we've collaborated on human rights conferences, on human rights events that have always been very successful, and so I'm convinced that this is going to be equally so. We have every confidence in this young man, I have to tell you. He recently published his first book, Human Rights in Flames, actually in 2012. He's worked for the UNDP Rule of Law Programme in the Office of the Palestinian Minister of Justice and in the USA-funded organisation, the Carter Center. He knows a lot more about human rights than I do, so I think it's probably appropriate that I hand over to Ala.
Thank you very much, Gary. this event here at the European Parliament. Distinguished members of the panel, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you, and thank you for the opportunity to speak on such an important matter. The Global Network for Rights and Development, as Gary just said, is an international NGO that works for supporting both human rights and development by adopting new strategies and policies for real change. One of the main objectives of our NGO is to promote and protect women's rights and to increase women's civil and political participation. Our work mainly focuses on the Middle East, North Africa, and now we're focusing also on Southern Europe and other parts of the world. Our role is to support with the contacts and the expertise to support women, with the contacts and expertise that they need to build their impact, their networks, and their influence, so that more women will get to hear and understand their rights and speak out and join with others to create change. In the context of conflict, women suffer differently and unequally. Sexual violence, among other war strategies, specifically targets women and girls. What I personally find both encouraging and honorable that these women always stand up for their rights and what they believe in. The main international instrument on women human rights that I would like to talk about today is the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, adopted by the UN General Assembly in December 1998. It codifies and recognizes the legitimacy of human rights activity and the need for it, and those who carry it out has to be protected. In every ongoing conflict in the world, women are greatly affected. Since the impact of conflict affects women of all ages, it is necessary to address the great role that youth can play in order to tackle these obstacles and offenses that women human rights defenders face, not only locally, but also by helping spread the word through social media and any other channels available. Due to this need to spread the word, I will share with you some of the cases I find most urgent. For instance, in the context of the ongoing Syrian conflict, where the human rights violations know no gender or age, I find it pressing to mention and discuss the situation of women are facing, both within the country or in the refugee camps around Syria. Representative of Global Network for Rights and Development and other UN agencies reported having had few cases referred to sexual violence, including rape, perpetrated against Syrian women during the conflict. Although most humanitarian assistance providers working with Syrian refugees said that they have few cases of sexual violence and they have all the equipment and the training to provide assistance to these women, victims had not come forward. It remains extremely difficult to measure the extent of crimes of sexual violence or to draw conclusions on patterns, in particular due to the stigma surrounding such crimes. However, reports including Global Network for Rights and Development report Rebelling Against Fear highlight that all women interviewed have witnessed or heard about cases of sexual violence and said that fear of being raped is the main issue and the main motivation that made their decision to flee from the country. Several women interviewed gave indirect accounts of rape and other forms of sexual violence committed by pro-government forces during the search or following the arrest and checkpoints or in detention. But there is also accounts of such crimes having been committed by the anti-government armed groups. Many of those interviewed also spoke of the risk of women being abducted by all parties to the conflict in order to obtain information or as a bargaining tool for the release of prisoners. According to our work, and research in the region, survivors of rape are sometimes forced into marriage in order to save the family honor. Risks of stigmatization and rejection of survivors impose a culture of silence, preventing women reporting crimes of sexual violence. As a result, the vast majority of those in need of medical and psychosocial support do not have access to such services. Personally, and as a Palestinian, when examining women's rights, my discussion must fall upon the plight of Palestinian women. Compiled in copious reports, there is a reality of torture and ill treatment of Palestinian women from the occupied territories who have been detained, interrogated, and imprisoned by the Israeli security forces. This problem in Palestine often goes unnoticed among all the other alarming human rights violations in the region. The issue of interrogation of Palestinian detainees by the General Security Services is certainly one that calls for global attention. During such interrogations, torture and ill treatment are brutally applied. Methods used are beating, slapping, kicking, stepping on shackles, bending the interrogee and placing her in other painful positions, violent shaking, sleeping problem, cursing, humiliating, depriving the detainee of essential needs, exposing them to extreme heat or cold, isolation and secrecy, and imprisonment under inhuman conditions. Many detainees complain of being denied proper medical care, education, and regular family visits. Women have no access to psychologists or to social workers. Sometimes it is impossible for detainees to communicate with doctors because of the language barriers. In light of such atrocities, the role of women human rights defenders becomes crucial as an important segment of civil society on both sides of ceasefire line. Women human rights defenders must play a crucial role in informal and formal peace processes by bringing the gender perspective and human dimension into the conflict resolution processes. Finally, political activism by women is commonly hindered by social paradigms and trends. Nevertheless, the international community should tackle these constraints and should better implement the previously referred Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. And it has to have special attention to women, since throughout history, women have demonstrated their commitment and capacity to confront human rights abuses towards them and all these who are around them. There is no better example to conclude than Eleanor Roosevelt and the colossal contribution that she made to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which at the end, this is why we are here all together today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Alan, thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to introduce, if I may, a young lady on my left, Leila Oliver. She's the chair of the Syrian Justice and Accountability Centre, which is a multilateral initiative based in The Hague that aims to document human rights violations and to propose a plan for transnational justice in post-conflict Syria. She's an international humanitarian law trainer and a researcher of violence against women in armed conflict. Leila, welcome.
Thank you very much for being here, and thank you again for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to speak to you today on the Day of Violence Against Women. I wish there was no such a day. I wish violence against women was not something we need to emphasize and talk about, but it is. And particularly in conflict areas, and now in the country where I come from, in Syria, I have been, I'd say, privileged to be able to research and know more about violence against women in Syria within this conflict, in order to tell you about it, tell people who can make a difference, and in order to gather resources and spread information that one day will get us to make a difference in that grim catalogue of violence that women in Syria have to suffer in this conflict. We now know that violence against women is happening. Sexual violence, violence targeting women, and several obstacles that are not allowing women to fulfill their potential in this conflict are happening. Many reports have been issued. International and national NGOs are talking about it. We know it's happening, and we know that perpetrators do not want anybody to know about it. Unfortunately, in law, the crime that's not documented does not exist. We know it happened. There's nothing we can do about it from a legal perspective. And this is why perpetrators always try to forbid us from documenting violations. And this is happening in Syria in a widespread manner by all perpetrators. The Syrian regime has effectively stopped every international organization, has stopped journalists, anybody who can document or report violations is being stopped from coming to Syria. If we follow the reports that have been issued by NGOs, we would know that the very few incidents that were documented were either documented outside of Syria, where also the other governments who are hosting refugees are not allowing enough documentation to take place. We have been denied entry to many refugee camps in many countries. And inside Syria, any violations have been done, they have been done without the concession of the Syrian regime, and those who are documenting have been targeted. We know of so many human rights defenders, journalists who have been targeted, and even those who have witnessed and whose witness we can use are being targeted. I've volunteered as a first aid worker for the Red Crescent for most of my life, and I can tell you that 20% of the volunteers I was with were targeted and killed by regime forces. By forces. We know that most of them were killed by regime forces. We assume that some of them were killed by other forces. Those are people who volunteered to provide humanitarian, to provide first aid to people who have been systematically denied healthcare. So not only journalists and human rights defenders are being targeted, but also anybody who have witnessed and can help us see what's happening. Same happened to doctors, lawyers, human rights defenders. You name them, they're being targeted. The only ones who are allowed in Syria and who are allowed to be effective in Syria are fighters. And unfortunately, as we all know, women, of course, as Gary said, it's more dangerous to be a woman in a conflict zone than a fighter. And I've seen this firsthand. Fighters always they manage to protect themselves, and they always have people protecting them. Unlike women, they do not have the means to protect themselves, and they're targeted by everybody. And sometimes they're being targeted by those who agree or disagree with them politically. We have seen Syrian women and women in conflict in general are feeling victimized and are feeling threatened by fighters by fighters who belong to any front. It's men with arms who are frightening them, and the loose use of arms is what's frightening them. I'll speak about sexual violence and about violence against women in Syria now, but I do it from a wide perspective. Catherine Jenkins said, violence against women happens by fighters who never learn to respect women. And this is particularly true in Syria because the disrespect of women has been a systematic act that is supported by law and practice for so many years. We've lived under repression for long enough for such pattern as the disrespect of women to be emphasized even by law. And I'll speak very quickly about what's the background, what's the roots of this unequal gender treatment that women face. Some of those violations are direct, straightforward. They're laws that disrespect women. They're laws that confine women to their sexual identity, to their being as sexual objects. And I'm not talking about a certain article in the law, I'm talking about almost every law in Syria. We do have an article that says that there's no discrimination. We have an anti-discrimination article in the Constitution, but it's not adapted, and many of our laws do have the contrary in their texts. Criminal law, honor crime, punishment of, a rapist can avoid punishment by marrying the rape victim. Personal status law, women have different treatment in custody, in marriage, and in divorce. They have different rights and different duties. Civil law, it puts restrictions to women's freedom of movement and other rights related to the right to witness, to bear witness in court. Nationality law, we cannot pass our nationality to our children if the children only can get their nationality through their fathers. And separate laws that are at the end saying Syrian women are different. They do not have the same right. They do not, it's emphasized by a legal system, it's emphasized by a constitution and laws. And you take this to practice, it's even more emphasized in practice. I have researched and I have found an unbelievable amount of precedents who are saying that Syrian women, who's allowing judges to discriminate against women, to pass precedents that will be used to further discriminate against women in the future. The legal system itself has been deteriorating over the past 40 years. Syria, the law school in Syria, the one that I was privileged to study in, was one of the oldest and one of the biggest in the Middle East, and in Arabic-speaking countries in the 30s. It has been one of the best in the 40s and 50s, even when we were colonized, and now it deteriorated to the extent that we are incapable of graduating people who can sustain the law and improve the law of the country. According to this, the legal system is corrupt. It's not monitored enough. We do not have enough monitoring by the Constitutional Court to stop judges from using the already discriminative laws to apply even more discriminative resolutions. A third thing that happened is the complete destruction of the Syrian feminist movement. We have a feminist movement that dates back to the 1916, where women stood up to colonization, they stood up to occupation, and unfortunately the Ba'ath regime managed to confine this movement into the Women's Association associated with the Ba'ath Party, where any form of feminist movement was stopped. So those factors together, they resulted in a situation of women where they're discriminated against, where they're not respected, and where they're confined to their physical existence. And thus, when you lose the law, when the rule of law collapses in a conflict situation, they'll be even more targeted. And I'll go very quickly through the indirect violations that women suffered from. Also, 40 years of deterioration resulted in poverty, and as we all know, poverty is feminized. Women suffer from poverty differently from men, especially in countries where the gender roles are decided and put differently, and different roles and duties and obligations are put at women. And the other thing is the destruction of educational system. Not only the higher educational system was destroyed, even the earlier stages were destroyed systematically. And all of this, women suffer from differently on every level. And as a result, I'll tell you a little bit. Surprisingly, one study, we have very, very bad statistics system in Syria. You can barely find any numbers, and as I told you, when it's not documented, it does not exist, whether it was good or bad. But a study by the UNFPA and the Syrian Family Protection Association was issued in 2009, And the government itself said that half of the Syrian women were subject to domestic violence. And by domestic violence that they're talking about, it's different from the domestic violence we know about. To have domestic violence reported, it means the woman ended up in hospital. Nobody would know about domestic violence that took place at home. So half of the Syrian women were violated to the extent they were actually abused and violated to the extent where they needed healthcare. What's even worse is a third of those were violated between the age of 10 and 15. So little girls are abused. They're violated to the extent that they need hospitalization. And what's even worse is that 7 out of every 10 women were verbally abused, were regularly verbally abused. And a third of the abused women thought that it's okay. They thought it's natural to be physically abused, and they reported that way, will not do anything about it. That is the result of a culture that degrades women. And on this, we now always go into the debate, whose fault? Is it the regime? Is it the fighting groups? We will not know that now. We do not have enough documentation. Everybody has his opinion. We do have information on some things. But the one thing I know is the violations that are taking place now might be caused by anyone, but the systematic deterioration of 40 years, we know who's in charge of this. It's a government who allowed systematic discrimination in law and in practice, and allowed their own selves to issue a report that says half of the women are violated, but we're not doing anything about it. So the physical violation now might be caused by anyone, but who's in charge of the degradation of women over the decades? That's a question. I think the answer is very obvious. Wars now target civilians more than they target fighters, and because what happened in Syria started as an uprising, there were no fighters to target, so only civilians were targeted. People went to the streets and called for freedom. They were targeted and shot and killed. A few months later, the militarization started, which is, it could be looked at as normal. It could be looked at that people want to defend themselves, or it could be looked at as a problem, as a mistake that the Syrians did. But what's clear is civilians were the main target of this, and they have suffered the most. And by civilians, well, now the few numbers that we have is the over 120,000 people were killed. And unfortunately, those are the numbers we know. The numbers we don't know are the massive amount of people who were injured to the extent that they will never have a normal life again. And what's even worse is the systematic targeting of health services. In Syria, a shot to the hand can kill you, a bullet to the hand can kill you, almost anything can kill you. People are being under siege to the extent of starvation. We are now handling polio again, 15 years of no polio in Syria. Now we're 40 cases of polio, which means that everybody could end up with polio. And not only that, a few weeks ago there was an article about the denial of healthcare and denial of vaccines. Vaccines are not getting to Syria. We know that relief and healthcare has been forbidden in the areas out of the regime control, but even in the areas within the regime control, it is not reaching there, which means that people who are not dying by the direct violence will die by other means. And those who do not die by both, they have absolutely no education, schools are closed, no health service, hospitals and field hospitals are being targeted. If I want to look at it, not only the direct violence that is a problem, it's the ongoing problem that we are getting a violent, we are turning this society into a violent society. And a violent society disrespects women by definition. Women do not have arms. When it's violent, it's about power. And it's about one interpretation of power, which is arms, weapons, physical power that women do not have. All the power that we managed to gain over the years is lost the moment that the society turns to violence. That's okay, madam? Okay. So what could be done? Now we know that things are very bad. What could be done? I followed every opposition group since the uprising started and asked them, what are you going to do about it? What are you going to do for us? We have started this uprising. We were at the heart of the uprising from day one. We were there at every step, and we have suffered as much and even more in some cases. And unfortunately, everybody told me that they will prosecute rape. Prosecuting rape is a good thing, but talking about it as empowering women is not. It's not only, again, me and Syrian women are confined to our physical existence. Prosecuting rape is not empowering to women. It's a perpetrator-centered measure that is not empowering the victim. It's actually to take the conscious troubles out of people who committed and facilitated this. And the other problem from a legal perspective is within the Syrian laws, perpetrators they have complete immunity. If I want to take them to court today, they will be released the day after. The Syrian regime over the years, issued laws that granted complete immunity to those who commit violence within their course of work, and that covers military, that covers security, who commit most of the crimes, and even anybody who's contracted with them. So even missionaries, anybody who's actually commissioned to do any service to them will be acquitted will get complete immunity. So technically, from a technical point, if I took them to court, they'll be released the day after. The opposition did not give me a way to they did not give women access to justice. What could be done is, of course, prosecution is important, but it's only one step of many steps that should take place together. No prosecution can happen without abolishing laws that grant immunity to perpetrators. The legal system should be given priority. We should grant them training, and we should grant them the chance to be constructed again. Unfortunately, in the areas outside of the regime control, we have a complete failure of the legal system. This is something we can support. And most importantly, how do we stop injustice? It's by stopping its causes. And its causes now is violence. Allowing the conflict in Syria to be prolonged will cause problems to women first. There's no way I can ask for women liberation when they live under shelling, when they are being starved. It's not a political option, it's a humanitarian one. I always say this, in Syria, we're not about who's the alternative, we're not about a failure in the political system. It's a humanitarian catastrophe that should be dealt with now. And by this I mean every effort should be put for humanitarian assistance. Half of the Syrian population, that's 11 million people, need direct humanitarian assistance. They've lost all their income, they're at the edge of starvation. 4.5 million of them are made refugees. They're in countries where unfortunately, most of the countries that are taking refugees are countries who cannot support them. They do not have the means to support them, and they do not always have the will. We do appreciate all the support that we get from neighboring countries, but that is not a permanent solution. The solution to refugees is giving them the country back, and giving it back to them before it's completely destroyed. That's the point that refugees need. So humanitarian assistance to those under siege inside Syria, humanitarian assistance and training to those outside Syria is a must. This is what will save women. And then when we talk about violence against women per se, again, the legal system should be given priority. The alternative legal measures that are taken in the liberated area included judges, self-appointed judges, which could be a good thing, but could be disastrous too. That initiative needs a lot of support. We have been trying to gather support for it, but a lot is yet to be done. And this is something, and the transition in Syria seems to be taking a very long time, so we need to find in transition measures, not only transitional measures. We all talk about what will happen in the post-conflict Syria. It doesn't look close to me. We need to see what should happen within the conflict. And finally, the integration of women now is not a women empowerment issue. It's an issue that's directly related to violence against women. If the men within the transition in Syria did not see women around, they will not learn to respect them. We'll always be subjects of that legal system, will not be sharing decision making. And unfortunately, I have to say the international community is not helping. We do get a line in the decision saying that women should be represented. Represented does not mean by women, they could be represented by men. Women should participate and it should be obligatory. It's not a choice. I've read something, it was mind-blowing actually. A tribunal suggested for Syria in the States, and a tribunal that consists of 12 men. They could not find one woman. None of them are Syrian, so you have all the options in the world for good judges, but they found 12 men. A meeting took place for Syria in London a few days ago, and there were no women. If I'm not giving a good example, how am I going to ask the Syrian opposition or the Syrian regime to include women if we're not including women when we are advocating for a political solution in Syria? It's not an option. I'm not talking about equality and rights of women now. I'm talking about stopping the violence. The violence will not stop except if women were included in the transition. And we all know that in the legal advancements that were achieved among the years, it's women judges and women lawyers who made a difference. If it wasn't for some women judges, rape would have never been defined. We would have lost all the efforts that we made after that. They need to be there in order for the experiences to be accommodated. And the very final point I need to talk about is, if we want to be pragmatic and talk that, I wish there was no militarization and I wish there was no armed conflict, but there is. And when we need to handle militarization, there's no point of talking about peace if we do not have a way to deal with military as it's happening, with militarization as it's happening. So implementing an effective policy, not a policy, an effective policy, we need to know every time we support partners, how are we going to take those arms from them. So this argument of demobilization is a must to protect women and to protect civilians. That's all that I have to say. I know it's not inspiring, and I know it's not, it's depressing to a stage, but there are women who are suffering at that place, and we can make a difference, and we should. Thank you very much.
Layla, thank you very much. That was very thought-provoking, and I think really you're bringing home to us the reality of what's going on today. Indeed, as we're sitting here speaking now, there are very dark things happening. I'd like to ask now to speak Dr. Aboza Elmana, who is the Vice President of the Global Network for Rights and Development. He has a PhD in the role of human rights in protecting minorities. Am I correct?
Women of Council.
Yes. And I'd just like to say that actually this event could not have happened without the organisation, without the GNRD, and so thank you very much for that, for allowing us all to come together.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, distinguished speakers, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of GNRD members and president and activists, I'd like to thank all of you, and I'm very happy to have you in this event. I just would like to say GNRD is very concerned about the violations against human rights. And we know in our case today, we are talking about violations against women. Armed conflict leads always to violations to women and children and all the people who are affected about this violation. So actually, the GNRD organized in 1 month, this month, the second event. The first was the 1st of November about violations against laborers and workers and migrants. And now we are talking about violations against women. What I'm asking our colleagues here just to raise or try to raise recommendations, because we are going to take your recommendations, and by the way, recommendations will be open. We can contact our colleagues here in our office in the process. We are going to take these recommendations to the coming sessions in Human Rights Council and in the coming session of CEDAW 80S session of CEDAW Commission on Status of Women was supposed to be held in New York, March 2014. So I have no more to say. Just we are in need to have your opinion in this issue. We'll take this recommendation, this recommendation from our colleagues here, and we'll take your recommendations either now or you can send it to our emails here in process or in the main office. And I just would like to add to your information that GNRD has more than 7 or 8 branches or offices in Geneva and in Norway, in Spain, in Australia, and here in Belgium. Also, we have partnership with African Union, and you know Africa and the whole issues of human rights in Africa, where I came from. Now, the issues of human rights is the one of main issues should be taken either in the schools or in the events like this or wherever, because the priority of our life to keep the dignity of humanity. So I'm very glad to be with you here and waiting to conclude our event and to push it to have a good future for our colleagues, our friends, for the human that we belong to.
I'd just like to finish by thanking you on behalf of Nikki for being here. I think it is very important that we do come together to discuss these things. There aren't many people in this world who can change the planet on their own. There are 1 or 2, but not many. I certainly know I can't change the world on my own, but I think that if we come together, we can actually make a difference, and that's why it's so important to have meetings like this and to just keep the pressure up, keep talking about the issues, keep shining the lights on the perpetrators, let the victims know that people are behind them, and that's how we can, I hope, make a difference. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much to the 3 speakers.